Tonight, when it finally fell apart.
Over the leadership of the Liberal Party.
It became obvious there wasn't going to be a positive outcome.
Details of the last-ditch Liberal efforts to keep Jody Wilson-Raybould in caucus. New information on the Prime Minister's close involvement.
Our education, our choice!
Students from hundreds of Ontario schools walk out in protest. Why they're angry at their premier and what they're demanding he do.
You have to think about how do you transport them safely and humanely.
And saving whales whose lives have been spent in captivity. Russia gets help from a world-famous oceanographer. This is The National.
Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott may be out of caucus, but the story of how that result unfolded continued to be told today. And no surprise, the various players offered different accounts. Tonight, we'll look at the latest from the women themselves and from some of their former colleagues. Katie Simpson has the details.
Over the leadership of the Liberal Party.
The urgent effort to keep Jody Wilson-Raybould on the Liberal team went right into this week. BC cabinet ministers who know her well were in her office as late as Monday, trying to reach some kind of truce.
There were issues that, that Jody raised, and I'm not going to get into the specifics because these were private conversations, but, that simply were things that the Prime Minister and the caucus certainly couldn't agree to.
It became obvious there wasn't going to be a positive outcome, and the conversations just came to an end.
Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott were expelled from caucus 24 hours later, a move which brought to an end secret high-level negotiations to ease the internal tensions which have hurt the Prime Minister and his party.
We've worked for a number of weeks over the past while to try and come together on a path forward that would restore some of the trust that had been eroded, and unfortunately it was obvious that we weren't able to do that.
I would have liked, well, all along, to have the Prime Minister come forward and accept some responsibility and to apologize to Canadians for what happened.
As CBC News first reported last night, sources say Wilson-Raybould came up with a list of at least 5 conditions she wanted met. It included firing 3 senior staffers, a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing by Justin Trudeau, and confirmation the new Attorney General would respect her decision in the SNC-Lavalin case. Reports about that last condition irked some of her former colleagues who now cry hypocrisy.
But if the AG is supposed to be independent, what's a former AG doing directing a Prime Minister to direct the AG to make a determination on a case when new evidence could be presented?
The new Attorney General says he was unaware of any requests, not that he'd listen anyway.
If someone tries to direct me to do anything, the Prime Minister's never tried to direct me. If someone else tries to direct me, then they'll hear about it from me.
Jody Wilson-Raybould said in an email tonight, "I have never and would never seek to interfere with the exercise of prosecutorial discretion by the Attorney General of Canada." After Wilson-Raybould issued her statement to CBC News, we recontacted our sources for the original story. A source says Wilson-Raybould raised the demand her decision on SNC-Lavalin be respected directly with the Prime Minister during their conversations in Vancouver before she resigned from Cabinet. But the source says that condition was not part of the conversations in the recent days leading up to Tuesday's expulsion from caucus. Jane Philpott didn't want to get into specifics, but she did say today that the Prime Minister if he had made a quick and clear apology, perhaps this controversy would have been contained. Rosie.
All right, so here we are. At this point, I imagine no viable path back into the caucus for either former minister.
It doesn't look like it, but Elizabeth May, the leader of the Green Party, says in the coming days she plans to approach both women to see if they want to join her team.
Okay, Katie Simpson in Ottawa on this developing story. Thank you, Katie.
Thanks.
So ask Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott, and they say an apology from the Prime Minister would have gone a long way. But would it have made this whole thing go away? Well, that's the question At Issue is going to tackle tonight. Chantal, Andrew, and Chris Hall are all here, and that is coming up in about 20 minutes' time. And investigators, I guess, have released their preliminary findings, Ian, into that crash of Ethiopian Airlines 737 MAX 8.
Yeah, Rosie, of course, it went down last month, killing all 157 people on board, nosediving just after takeoff, and this new report makes for some grim reading. The jet hit speeds well above its operational limits, 925 kilometers an hour, when the data recorder stopped working. And there is a troubling similarity to October's Lion Air crash in Indonesia, which killed 189 people. Also a MAX 8, whose pilots also battled to keep their plane pointing upwards. 2 fatal crashes in 5 months, 2 apparent cases of pilots struggling to control their planes. Investigators aren't laying blame yet, but as Jacqueline Hansen tells us, they've certainly said enough to get Boeing's attention.
Data from the crash suggests there was a struggle between the Ethiopian Airlines plane and its pilots. The Ethiopian government says when the aircraft started to malfunction and push the plane's nose down, the pilots followed Boeing procedures to fix it, repeatedly trying to take manual control of the plane.
The crew performed all the procedures repeatedly provided by the manufacturer, but was not able to control the aircraft.
That seems to point to the aircraft's anti-stall system, known as MCAS, that was new to the 737 MAX aircraft. It's supposed to lower the plane's nose if it pitches up too fast. This evening, Boeing CEO said that anti-stall system activated when it shouldn't have.
As pilots have told us, erroneous activation of the MCAS function can add to what is already a high workload environment. It's our responsibility to eliminate this risk. We own it, and we know how to do it.
Boeing had recommended that pilots turn off the system if there were problems and fly manually. It's still working to fix the software, and there are reports their review uncovered a second unrelated problem. The company was expected to submit its fix for FAA approval last week, but it says it needs more time. Canada's transport minister says the Canadian government won't rely on the FAA's sign-off.
I can assure Canadians that the 737 MAX 8 is not going to be allowed to fly until we are totally satisfied that it is a safe plane to fly.
Boeing's CEO is still confident in the aircraft's safety. He went on a test flight just yesterday. But today's findings aren't likely to help the company's battered reputation. Regaining the trust of airlines and travelers is likely to be a long and costly endeavor. Jacqueline Hansen, CBC News, Toronto.
Boeing is facing a number of lawsuits. One of the most recent was filed by the extended family of consumer rights advocate Ralph Nader.
Usually airlines and aircraft manufacturers get away with a quick settlement, a little bit of a public relations problem. My message to Boeing is, don't think this is going to happen again.
Nader's 24-year-old niece was killed in last month's Ethiopian Airlines flight. He's calling for a full recall of the MAX 8 jets and a consumer boycott. The family suit also targets a Boeing supplier, as well as the airline and the Federal Aviation Administration. It seems, though, Boeing has enough confidence in its jet that it hasn't slowed down production. According to one report, its Renton facility, that's just outside Seattle, is sticking to a carefully orchestrated schedule for 737 MAXs to raise the monthly output to 57 jets by mid-year.
Thousands of students across Ontario walked out of class today. They were protesting changes to education planned by the provincial Progressive Conservative government. The students say they're upset with new mandatory online classes, cuts to autism programs, and increased class sizes that could result in the elimination of thousands of teaching jobs.
My mom is also a teacher, and next year I am going to the University of Windsor for teaching. So this is going to affect me down the road because of how many jobs they're cutting.
I'm here because what Doug Ford doing is completely unacceptable.
His budget cuts, it's putting one of my favorite teachers out of a job.
We are here to protest for our future.
No cuts to education! No cuts to education!
Increasing class sizes is literally just going to, the students who are the most vulnerable are going to suffer even more. And that's not fair to my peers, that's not fair to me, and I don't want bigger class sizes. That's why I'm here today.
For his part, Premier Doug Ford is brushing off the walkout as a teachers' union organized stunt. Nicole Ireland was at one of the protests.
Thousands of students across the province walked out of their classrooms just after 1 o'clock this afternoon. It all started with an Instagram post from a student in southwestern Ontario that went viral. Here at Arundel Secondary School in Mississauga, just west of Toronto, hundreds of students took part in the walkout. 15-year-old Mallory Ball helped organize today's protest.
I hope that the government realizes that we're not numbers, that we're actual people, and that all of these changes aren't just meant to fuel the economy, that they're going to change our education and they're going to change our lives.
Ball and her fellow organizers aren't just thinking about their own education. As some of them made signs last night to prepare for the protest, they were also thinking about how funding cuts, including fewer teachers, will affect students with special learning needs.
Having less teachers means that we'll have less support. And same with class sizes. We also have teacher assistances, either for ASD children or children who need have a special individual learning plan or ESL. They'll also be impacted. And I actually have a sister who's on the autistic spectrum.
In question period today, Ontario Premier Doug Ford defended his government's plans, saying class sizes will still be lower than in other provinces. Ford accused teachers' unions of instigating today's student walkout.
Let's start focusing on the students and stop using the students as a bunch of pawns, because that's what the union bosses are doing right now.
Both the elementary and secondary school teachers' unions say they had absolutely no involvement in the protests. Students say they're speaking for themselves. Sabisha Suresh Kumar has this message for the government.
I hope that they realize that we will be able to vote next term, and we do have the power to vote them out.
Nicole Ireland, CBC News, Mississauga, Ontario.
Alberta's provincial election campaign is quick, just 28 days long, and there are 12 days left. Tonight, the campaign moved on screen for the first and likely only televised leadership debate. 4 candidates, leaders of the ruling NDP, the Alberta Party, the Liberal Party, the United Conservative Party, tried to shift the race in their favor.
Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
Most of what Mr. Kenney has said in his presentation just now is pure political theater.
The fact of the matter is, Albertans are still waiting for the pipeline.
Wait a second.
You are entitled,
the
Mr.
day
Kenney.
he announced his tanker ban, Premier, you didn't raise a word of protest.
Rachel Notley's NDP is fighting from behind tonight. Polls have narrowed, but she still trails Jason Kenney's United Conservative Party. But Notley did make the election call when Kenney was on the defensive.
They are so desperate to talk about anything except the issues that matter most.
Amid allegations his bid to win the UCP leadership back in 2017 involved working with a so-called kamikaze candidate whose sole purpose was to attack Kenney's main competitor, then drop out. That's something denied by Kenney and the UCP, but the RCMP and Alberta's election commissioner are looking into it. On top of that, 2 UCP candidates resigned for intolerant or white nationalist rhetoric online. And Kenney's under pressure to fire a third for recorded remarks described by many as homophobic. Kenney himself has been focused on the economy. Alberta's economic performance is expected to lag behind other provinces for 2019 before bouncing back next year. That means for some voters, Notley's record will put her on the defensive. And the CBC's Rafi Boudjikanian is following the campaign and tonight's debate. And Rafi, we do expect this is the only time all 4 of these leaders will face off in front of the cameras. What sort of stands out for you tonight?
Ian, as the exchange you just showed demonstrated, it was really not very collegial at all. The debate quickly got bitter and heated. One exchange that stood out for me was about trust and integrity. Those are themes that Rachel Notley and the NDP have really been picking on throughout the 2 weeks we've seen so far of this campaign, and ones that don't look very good for Jason Kenney because of those investigations you mentioned. So tonight, Notley really picked on that question of leadership.
The leadership campaign of which you were a part is under RCMP investigation, Mr. Kenny. They are talking to the RCMP who are investigating the wrongdoing. We have seen documents that have been released which show a clear connection between people in your campaign and Mr. Callaway's campaign. Is it normal for you to, do you think it's normal politics to run somebody as a kamikaze candidate in order to take down your most competitive?
All right, we want to bring everybody into this conversation, please, one at a time.
You know, I watched some of the debate. It was lively. There was some real interaction there. Did you see anything, Rafi, though, that may change the dynamics of the campaign?
Well, one thing I'll note that is in response to what Notley said just there, Kenny said this is downright defamatory, and it's the first time I've seen him use such strong language to defend himself. One thing that wasn't different at all was Kenny coming back to questions of the economy, because that's what's sort of been working for him throughout this campaign. Here's a little bit of what he had to say.
Grow the economy. That's what this debate and this election is about, getting people back to work. Now, the Premier just once again trashed businesses and employers who actually create the jobs in our economy. She came to office promising to raise royalties. She raised taxes on employers' incomes, property, helped Mr. Trudeau raise payroll taxes and her carbon tax, increased red tape,
might I get in at any
and led
point?
to an economic crisis in this province where some say.
Now, even when the debate pivoted toward other themes like healthcare and education, Kenny kept coming back to questions of money and how he says the NDP is overspending without achieving anything. Notley, meanwhile, tried to turn towards social issues, toward those hateful comments by some candidates of the UCP that you alluded to, Ian. But, of course, whose messages resonated more with voters is something we'll only see in about 2 weeks.
Okay, Rafi, thank you. We know polling is not an exact science, but it can give us a sense of which party voters appear to prefer. According to CBC's poll tracker, which pulls together data from several surveys, the United Conservative Party has had a commanding and consistent lead over the NDP since long before the election call last month. Since then, it's narrowed from about 15 points to 10. The Alberta and Liberal parties are both polling well under 10%. You can find the poll tracker with details on its sources and methodology at cbcnews.ca. And here's some other developing stories we're following tonight. Police have now issued a Canada-wide arrest warrant for a third suspect over the kidnapping of an international student.
He is considered armed and dangerous. That warrant is issued. We need to get him into custody right away.
And he's referring to this man, 28-year-old Mazama Adao from Toronto. It's alleged he's one of the men who forced Chinese student Wan Zhenlu into a van in a parking garage. Lu turned up at a home about 150 kilometers away 3 days later. 2 other men have also been arrested. A 4th suspect still on the run tonight. Toronto City Councillor John Fillion says bullets were fired into his home and car early this morning. Fillion lives with CBC radio host Anna Maria Tremonti, who was at home at the time but not injured. Fillion won't comment on who he thinks is behind the shooting, but in a statement he said, this follows an incident 3 weeks ago in which a man with a weapon attempted unsuccessfully to force his way into my home. I suspect I've been targeted, and this is related to my work as a city councillor.
I had tonight a bizarre twist in the case of a little boy who disappeared nearly a decade ago.
And later, we'll take you inside a rescue mission to save nearly 100 whales in captivity.
First, though, should Canada be doing more to reduce waste at the grocery store?
I think it's totally bonkers.
And then inside...
No, tell me it's not. No, tell me
no.
Yeah.
More plastic. We'll put that question to the Environment Minister next. When you think of ground zero for upcoming environmental battles in Canada, your local grocery store may not be the first place you think of, but it is a place that's caught not only the Canadian government's attention, but the attention of governments around the world. In this week's Marketplace investigation, David Common surveys store shelves, looking for the most egregious examples of problem packaging.
No?
No.
Go grocery shopping, and there's just no escaping it.
Look at the sea of plastic, David.
Yeah. Product after product coated in layer after layer.
That's a complete waste. Complete waste. Shame on that company.
And, says environmental journalist Adria Vassal, just 11% of it ever gets recycled. Much of it can't be, even if it ends up in the blue bin.
Not recyclable. Not recyclable. Not recyclable. End of story.
Even legal weed, a brand new industry, isn't buying into sustainable packaging.
If it comes from the government of Ontario and they're starting a brand new program from scratch, you'd think that they'd try a little harder to make sure everything was fully, legitimately recyclable.
Governments have talked about taking action to reduce plastic, and now the European Union is doing that, announcing a ban on plastic cutlery, plates, straws, coffee stirrers, cotton buds, and styrofoam containers. So what about Canada? We asked you to send us pictures of what you thought was most egregious, then ran a poll to rate the worst packages, ending up with these 6 products.
I think it's totally bonkers.
A chocolate bar. And we showed them all to the Federal Environment Minister, Catherine McKenna.
With plastic, more plastic.
With more plastic, and then inside...
No, tell me it's not. No, tell me no.
Yeah, more plastic. And stand by, says McKenna, a national strategy to reduce single-use plastics is coming to Canada, but not necessarily an outright ban as some have called for. Why not just come out and say, we're done with these?
We are looking at that, and this is part of our strategy, so we're working with provinces and territories.
In the meantime, 90% of those polled said plastic pollution is a problem. As other countries take the lead on fighting back, Canada's plan has yet to be revealed. David Common, CBC News, Ottawa.
Now, as we wait for federal and provincial plans, several municipalities are already on their way to tackling problem plastic. Just over a year ago, Montreal became the first major Canadian city to ban single-use plastic bags. Victoria, BC, followed suit 6 months later with its own ban, and Vancouver's ban on plastic straws, as well as foam takeout containers and cups. That's expected to take effect later this spring. Now, David's story is just a glimpse of what you'll see on this week's Marketplace. Be sure to tune in tomorrow night on CBC Television at 8 p.m., 8:30 in Newfoundland.
Up next on The National, could it have been as simple as just an apology from the Prime Minister to Jody Wilson-Raybould? We will dive back into the SNC-Lavalin affair with these guys, the At Issue Gang. Chantal, Andrew, and Chris will be here after the break. But first, in case you missed it,
unfortunately, this child is not our beloved Timothy.
Another layer to the heartbreak today for the family of a missing boy in Illinois. Timothy Pitson vanished in 2011 when he was just 6. His mom took him on a road trip, then took her own life. She left a note saying he was with people who would care for him, but, quote, "You will never find him." But for the last day and a half, there was real hope.
So we had this child who said he ran away. He said he was kidnapped. Last name is Pitson, P-I-T-Z-E-N.
Yesterday, a person claiming to be the 14-year-old boy showed up in Kentucky, telling police he had escaped his captors.
He looked out of place. He looked scared. He was lost.
Timothy's family was cautious but optimistic.
Regardless of what anybody said, I knew he was alive.
DNA tests were done, but today all they confirmed was that it was all a lie. The man posing as Timothy is really a 23-year-old ex-con who just got out of prison. Police aren't saying what his motive was.
It's devastating. Yeah. It's like reliving that day all over again.
Despite that cruelty, Timothy's family is making one thing very clear. There is no giving up.
My prayer has always been that when he was old enough, he would find us if we couldn't find him.
You're looking at the courthouse in Christchurch, where the man who opened fire on 2 mosques was charged today with 50 counts of murder. The gunman is also facing 39 counts of attempted murder for those who were injured in the massacre last month. The judge has ordered the 29-year-old undergo a mental assessment to determine whether he's fit for trial.
Recent actions regarding the dropping of all charges against Mr. Smollett are particularly worrisome, due to a complete lack of communication and failure to follow established procedures by the Office of Ken Fox.
Chicago police are demanding the resignation of the city's top prosecutor because of the decision to drop charges against Jussie Smollett. The Empire actor faced 16 felony counts for lying to police about being the victim of a hate crime. Chicago says it will also be suing Smollett after he missed today's deadline to pay the $130,000 to cover the investigation costs. Health Canada says it may soon suspend sales of this type of breast implant linked to cancer. This is after a joint CBC News Toronto Star investigation. The federal government says it's been notified of 28 confirmed cases of a serious but rare type of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. 24 of those cases involved Allergan's BioCell breast implant. The company has been given 15 days to respond.
The allegations in the Globe story this morning are false.
That was the Prime Minister's first response back in February to allegations the former Attorney General faced inappropriate political pressure on the SNC-Lavalin criminal case. And that's when things began to unravel, and fast. Jody Wilson-Raybould resigned from Cabinet. Gerald Butts, the Prime Minister's principal secretary, also resigned. There were hearings at the Justice Committee. Michael Warnick, the clerk of the Privy Council. Wilson-Raybould, Butts, Warnick again. Jane Philpott resigned. Warnick resigned. There were text messages and one audio recording released, all leading up to this week.
Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott are no longer members of the Liberal Caucus.
Now, the former Liberal MPs say this could have been avoided had the Prime Minister apologized.
To admit that mistakes were made, to apologize to Canadians for it.
To have the Prime Minister come forward and accept some responsibility and to apologize to Canadians.
So, does this all really come down to an apology? And where does the government and the opposition go from here? It's Thursday, and that means At Issue is here to try and make sense of it all. Goodness knows we've needed them through these many weeks. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, Andrew Coyne is in Toronto, and Chris Holt joins us in Ottawa tonight. Good to see everybody. So let's start with where that little clip pack left off, this notion of an apology or an acceptance of responsibility or lack thereof. Given that we know that there were talks between people in the Prime Minister's office, people in Caucus and in Cabinet, and Jody Wilson-Raybould, do you think, Chantal, do you have a sense that that would have solved things here in a way that we wouldn't be in this place where we are today?
I think that if that were ever going to happen, it would have happened on that famous morning when the Prime Minister, remember, after Gerald Butts testified, actually talked about a loss or a break in communications or whatever, but did not apologize. And I think that neither the clerk nor Gerald Butts in testimony laid the ground for the Prime Minister to say something bad happened and I apologize for it, because neither of them accepted or said that they felt that they did anything wrong or that they crossed any line.
But Andrew, if I imagine this message was clear to the PMO and to people inside government, that was really an important point for both of the women at the center of that. Is there a reason why the Prime Minister couldn't have done that? Would that have looked too weak? Would it have been admission of something? What would have been the danger in doing it?
Well, they embarked upon a strategy from the beginning that they were going to, first of all, deny this. And then once they got beyond denying, they were going to minimize it and say it wasn't really that bad a deal. We were just seeking information, or we were just wanting to give advice, or what have you. I don't think the issue is an apology. I mean, I know we in the media like that because we like things to be personal, et cetera. I think it's an accounting. And by accounting, I mean, first of all, a clear statement, transparency about what happened. And secondly, an admission that it shouldn't have happened. This was wrong. And instead, what we've had is weeks of denial and deflection and red herrings and the kangaroo court of the Justice Committee, and every attempt to block people from finding out what happened, and certainly no acknowledgement, including that prime ministerial press conference, that any of this was really wrong, that any lines were crossed, or that anything was unacceptable in trying to pressure the Attorney General into interfering in a criminal prosecution. And that, to me, is the nub of the issue. Whether he apologizes, says I'm sorry, is really, to me, irrelevant.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, I'm using that word, but what I guess I really mean, and I think what the two ladies mean as well, is an admission that something happened. But Chris, don't we see through the actions taken by the Prime Minister's office that there is an admission that something didn't work the way it was supposed to here?
Yeah, he summed it a line and said, I think the communications could have been better. I understand that this was not the way it should have unfolded, but he's never said he's sorry. And I think that's what Jane Philpott, at least today, was implying was necessary. And I don't know how you apologize if you refuse to admit that you did anything wrong. I listened to Carla Qualtrough on News Network earlier today saying that she thought the Prime Minister had taken responsibility for the breakdown already. Carla Qualtrough, of course, is one of the people that sources said had been involved in trying to negotiate some kind of an agreement between the Prime Minister's office and both Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott. So in the end, would an apology have sufficed? If done early enough, I suppose it could have nipped this in the bud. I really just don't see, having covered this the way we have with the he said, she said, he wrote, she wrote, he said, she taped, that we're ever going to get an apology to end this whole thing.
I certainly think as a matter of self-preservation, so let's leave aside, what should have been done, but just from a matter of political strategy, it would have been a much shorter story had they come out with everything the first day. One assumes, usually that's the case. It was the case, for example, with the Nigel Wright, Michael Duffy thing. If they'd had a press conference the next day and taken accountability for it and explained what went on, it would have been bad for them, but it wouldn't have been as bad as the 2-year story it became. I think this is very similar. The one caveat I would say to that is they may have had good reason not to want to fess up because there may be more to this that we don't know.
Okay, so on this, I agree with Andrew totally that if they'd done this from day one, we wouldn't be talking about this tonight.
No, yes.
I'm not sure, though, that it is because there's so much more to find out, and I'm based this in part on interviews given this week by both Jane Philpott and Jody Wilson-Raybould, who say that they feel that the basic facts are out in the open. But if there has been one consistent line from people around Justin Trudeau, and Justin Trudeau is that to this day, they are convinced that they did nothing wrong and they crossed no line. And I think we're going to be left with that from them as of now.
What I find interesting, though, about the reporting that we did last night and some today is what seems to be a very serious attempt, I would say, on both sides, whether it be with Jody Wilson-Raybould or with people around the Prime Minister or members of Caucus, over like a 5-week period to try and reach some sort of agreement. What does that tell you?
Well, all I can say about that is I can't think of another Prime Minister, make of that what you want, who would have negotiated for all that time. At some point, the fish or cut bait issue should have come much earlier if they were not going to resolve it. We were leaked the demands that were made by Jody Wilson-Raybould. I can't think again of Jean Chrétien or Brian Mulroney or Stephen Harper negotiating on that basis. So to me, it speaks of amateur hour in the PMO and nothing more than that.
I take a somewhat different view of this. I think it is a recognition that Jane Philpott and Jody Wilson-Raybould represented something very important to both this Prime Minister and to this government. One, an Indigenous woman who's from British Columbia, which is an important province for the Liberals, with the TMX pipeline still in the offing, and Jane Philpott, who handled some very difficult files, including the Indigenous Services file. So I think he bent over backwards in the sense of trying to be able to find a way out and to keep these two players in his caucus at the very least. But by the time he finally got around to acknowledging that he couldn't, it was now a point of where he had to expel them from caucus, which I'm sure, from having listened to people around this place, was the last thing that they really wanted to do.
Yeah,
Andrew?
I guess I take yet a third view of it, which is I'm not sure there needed to be that much negotiation. What she was asking was not unreasonable. It was take accountability for what happened, hold to account the worst offenders, 2 of whom have already gone, and make sure it doesn't happen again. I agree if you're looking at it purely from a standpoint of sticking to your story and not conceding anything wrong was done, I can understand why he wouldn't do it. But from the standpoint of if you had no bad story to tell, if you were perfectly innocent of the charges, then it seems to me, as from the word go on this thing, you would have been perfectly happy to do exactly what she was asking. So I understand why he'd be a stick in the mud on it, but I don't think it justifies it.
Okay, all of our faces said something there. Go ahead, Chantal. Yeah.
I would just quarrel with one thing. I've read that list, and one of those conditions was ensuring that the next Attorney General not review her own decision on SNC-Lavalin. I can't imagine that an Attorney General who wants to be independent could be told on the basis of some backroom political deal between his predecessor and the Prime Minister that he cannot come to his own decision on a file.
Well, it's not at all.
And if the no, but if the issue is the independence of the Attorney General, you cannot tie him down to the decision of his predecessor. That would be, on the face of it, an unacceptable condition. Plus, if you are the Prime Minister and you're told that you should own up to something and you agree to that, but then fire everyone around you that acted on your orders, what does that say about you? That you're willing to throw everyone overboard when you yourself admit responsibility. So if you were going to meet those conditions, I think at the end of the day, if you were Justin Trudeau, you'd be better off just resigning.
Yeah, on that first point, we only have one side's interpretation of this, and it requires, it seems to me, heroic amounts of bad faith to assume that what she meant by that was not that she didn't want the Prime Minister to apply the same pressure to the AG, to the new AG as he applied to her, that he didn't want him directing him to do a DPA. That seems to me the more plausible interpretation than to say she suddenly reversed herself on the whole principle she'd been fighting for the last 7 weeks and for months before that, and suddenly decided she was in favor of the Prime Minister interfering with an AG. It seems to me that requires an amazing amount of bad faith to interpret it that way.
But to testimony, she did say that she had decided in her mind when she accepted another cabinet position that she would resign if her successor changed the decision, which actually doesn't go to your interpretation.
No,
but
I want to pull back if I can. I also heard that issue was removed from the list as sort of these negotiations went on. So it was there. Whether it stayed, I don't know. I just want to ask the not so simple question about where the government goes from here. You know, both the MPs, the two women are out doing some interviews today, tomorrow, in the coming days. But as Chantal rightly points out, they don't, either of them seem to suggest that there is more that they have to offer. So this will just be their perspective. So what happens now? What does the government hope for? Is there any room there for them to change anything, or are they really, you know, damaged in a serious way now and can't recover before the election? Chantal.
The Prime Minister's brand is certainly damaged, and you saw it this week when he spoke to the Daughters of the Vote, and that was a microcosm of the reaction out there. For some people who believe that he was on the right side of the issue, he has come across as weak, and for others, he has been on the wrong side of the issue. So it's a lose-lose. I'm not convinced that the story is entirely played out, not the SNC-Lavalin story, but what happens to Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott. Frankly, if I were the NDP, I'd been trying really hard to get at least one of them to come on board.
Okay, Chris talked to the leader of the NDP today, so I'll let him pick up there.
Well, yeah, he's open to having conversations with them, Jagmeet Singh says, but there's some issues with Jody Wilson-Raybould. His own party was very critical of some of the files that she handled around assisted dying, for example. So I think that would be a harder sell. Maybe Jane Philpott is difficult riding for the NDP, but I take Chantal's point that it would be certainly worth their while to do so. To your main question, though, I'm not sure that the Liberals have to do anything more now than just simply really continue to hammer away at the budget they put out there and hope that that takes over if there's nothing else to come out, the narrative that comes out of this place. Justin Trudeau has taken questions almost on a regular basis, if not daily basis, through the midst of this. He's been damaged, I think, his brand as a feminist and perhaps even as a man who believed that the Indigenous relationship was the most important. By getting rid of these two people, it would send the opposite signal. But if the worst is behind him now, with a budget that still hasn't been fully debated and explored, I think they at least have the option now, or the opportunity now, to change the channel.
Last minute to you, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, the government is in possession of most of the cards in any situation like this. I still think the government has shown an unrivaled ability to shoot themselves in the foot on this. What was accomplished positively for them, again, just from a narrowly partisan point of view, by kicking Philpott and Wilson-Raybould out of Caucus is still defeats me. I do not understand how that.
I can tell you that the MPs here are pretty okay with that.
No, it
may just be that simple, though. You know,
it doesn't answer my question as to how that benefits them as a party. But that being done, it's going to be hard for the opposition to keep this going much longer. But the damage, to some extent, will have been done to the Prime Minister's image and to the parties. Some of that will fade by election time, but not all of it.
Okay, got to leave it there. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Before we go, be sure to subscribe to At Issue, the podcast, for extra content. This week, we're talking about the fate of the new NAFTA deal. Remember that? 15 news cycles ago. Look for it on iTunes, any major podcast app, our website, cbcnews.ca/thenational.
And up next on The National, the urgent effort to free nearly 100 whales trapped in Russia's so-called whale jail.
There are no reasons to keep any of those animals in captivity. They don't have any physical injuries which would prevent them from survival in the wild.
Chris Brown brings us that story from Moscow right after the break. You're looking at a so-called whale jail in Russia, where since last fall, dozens of whales have been held captive. Russian companies plan to sell them, something police have stopped for now. But with these pens capturing international attention and with serious concerns about the whales' health, there's an effort underway to set them free. That's not easy or straightforward. A team of marine specialists arrived in Moscow today, and they bring a warning. If you set those whales free, they may not survive. Chris Brown explains.
Whale conservationists have never tackled a problem as large as this. They want to free 87 belugas and 10 juvenile orcas from these pens near Vladivostok, caught as part of a shadowy trade in selling live animals to Chinese marine parks. Faced with the backlash, Russia's government took the unusual step of asking for international advice.
Que l'espèce qui est dans les océans.
It invited Jean-Michel Cousteau, son of renowned ocean explorer Jacques Cousteau, to help come up with a plan to release them.
It's not easy, but it's going to happen, hopefully, for most of them.
Freeing this many whales has never been attempted before, and it's fraught with challenges, says American conservationist Charles Vinnick, who's also part of the advisory team.
You have to think about how do you transport them safely and humanely to an area where they can be released, where there's sufficient food and adult whales to help them learn what they may not have learned as youth when they were captured.
While environmental groups such as Greenpeace are generally supportive,
I have some concerns that some of these whales may not be released.
Whale researcher Grigory Sadolko fears the companies that used a legal loophole to catch the whales could still end up selling some of them.
Those companies, on contrary, they are still hoping and, as far as I know, lobbying for at least some of those animals be left in their possession so they can sell them as planned.
It's possible some whales died over the cold winter, and others may have caught diseases. So, Cousteau's team plans to spend the next week studying the animals, yet he cautions with rehabilitation issues to consider, all may not be let go immediately.
It may take years. We don't know yet.
While Russia has moved to close the loophole that allowed these whales to be caught and sold, it still permits whales to be captured for scientific or educational purposes. It's proposing a quota of 10 orcas for next year. Chris Brown, CBC News, Moscow.
And a footnote to the story closer to home. A Canadian bill making it illegal to keep whales and dolphins in captivity took a big step forward this week. Bill S-203 passed the Commons Fisheries Committee on Tuesday. If it makes it through Parliament before the next election, it would levy fines up to $200,000 on parks and aquariums found in violation. But existing animals would be grandfathered in, and there's just one facility right now with a long-term commitment to keep whales and dolphins. That's Marineland in Ontario.
The Moment is up next, and tonight it's a celebration for a swimmer who turned her fear of the water into a first-place finish.
Don't let anybody put you down. Just come down and show your wonderful, unique talent.
Jessie Stewart was a member of Team Canada at the Special Olympics World Games this year. Her race, the 25-meter relay, she dove in, swam hard, and then she won. Jessie and her gold medal just arrived back at her Nova Scotia training pool, and her welcome home is our moment.
Jessie, 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 Jessie. We swam so fast, and we came first. I was sad. I was in foster care my whole life, struggling, and one day I wanted to try Special Olympics. I was scared of water, very scared of water, and I was scared people find out I'm special needs.
Tonight is a celebration
not just of Jessie doing well, but you know, for me, it's also a celebration of inclusion, and it's an important statement to her of how important she is to the team.
So I'm going to keep swimming for my whole life, I think so. I have all talent, ability, and nobody can stop me now because I'm going to keep going.
The power of the Special Olympics, all the people who spend time organizing it, and of course the young men and women and adult men and women who take part. And keep this in mind, 190 nations took part in the event that she was at, 7,500 athletes.
And just to underline, I mean, the power of the individual stories. I mean, so this happened in Abu Dhabi, right? A world away. This was Jessie's first trip abroad, I understand. Her first trip on an airplane. First time I bet she's felt like this big of a celebrity. First time on the National, I'm guessing. That's huge.
Yeah, and remember what she said there. She had never got in the pool before.
Yeah.
Already a much better swimmer than I am, for sure.
You and me both.
And won the gold medal. I mean, she's great. She's great. That's the National for April 4th. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.